Hi everyone, welcome to episode 24 of Engaging the Eagle, exploring US foreign policy in Southeast Asia. I'm Kevin, an Associate Research Fellow at USP,
Hi, this is Adrian, Research Fellow and Coordinator of the US program.
and will be your host for this episode on Deal or No Deal, US-China Relations under Trump 2.0. With his cabinet staffed in large part by China hawks, many observers had surmised that US President Donald Trump would pursue a confrontational policy against China. Yet, from holding back on his initial threat to impose 60% tariffs on Chinese imports to seeking a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, there are signs that he is seeking to strike a deal with Beijing. What should we make of this, and what are the prospects for US-China ties in the immediate future? Our guest for this episode is Jude Blanchette, Distinguished Tang Chair in China Research and Director of the RAND China Research Center, to discuss US-China ties. Thanks for joining us today, Jude.
It's a delight and an honor.
So, I think we'd like to start broadly first. How would you characterize the current state of ties between the US and China?
It's a great question. In some ways, if you were to just be looking at US-China relations now, you could almost adopt a few different storylines for where US-China relations are right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think anyone that got into a time machine from the year 2016 and arrived at now and looked at what the Trump administration had done just on tariffs would think we'd seen a major escalation. We have 20% across the board tariffs that only because the Overton window on trade and tariffs has shifted so dramatically is not considered an extraordinary escalatory initial battle in a major trade war.
Mm-hmm.
But because, of course, we've seen tariffs from the first Trump administration and even under the Biden administration, they not only kept the Trump tariffs on, they added additional tariffs on targeting Chinese EVs. We've gotten so used to them, I think in some ways it feels like these are just opening skirmishes, and the US-China relationship in some ways is in a bit of a holding pattern. I know we'll talk about this later, but it's hard to categorize where it is now, given all the uncertainty, both about how President Trump himself is thinking about where he wants to steer US-China relations. We're recording this now after some of the news has broken that a summit between Xi and Trump looks more likely. Yesterday, Trump himself confirmed that he'll be meeting Xi in the United States, quote, in a short amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes it challenging to characterize the relationship in a way that it was more straightforward in the Biden administration when we had adopted that framing of strategic competition. The policy process in Washington was aligned around strategic documents which laid out what the administration was trying to do. Now it's a bit of a head scratcher for many of us. But let me just sort of end this meandering initial answer by saying, in fundamental ways, if we were to take the prospect of a summit off the table, in some ways the relationship is similar to what it was on January 19th, but with some additional tariffs. The United States still is engaged in a broad array of competitive policies. You're still seeing documents come out of this administration, like the America First Investment Plan, which lay out a pretty hawkish, aggressive agenda for limiting and pushing the de-risking or decoupling between the US and China even further. China's own policy agenda hasn't wavered much. They're still focused on their own strategy of de-risking and decoupling from the United States. They're plowing ahead with massive investments in strategic technologies. China's military posture hasn't changed. Ours hasn't in fundamental ways. So I don't mean to avoid a direct answer. I think it's just hard to characterize where we are at this precise moment.
Well, you hit the nail on the head that it's quite difficult to characterize the state of the relationship right now, but it's a good way to set the scene for the rest of this discussion. Adrian, did you have a question?
Yeah, Jude, again, thanks for joining us. So where do you think, right, sort of the Trump administration is headed? For us in Southeast Asia, we are, of course, very interested in what the contours of a Trump foreign policy towards China is going to be. For us here, it is most likely that the administration's relations with Southeast Asia will also be embedded in this larger US-China relations?
It's another good question, and I this will be the one time I make this statement. That way, I don't preface every question by saying some version of "I don't know." But let me just say that as a structural matter, what's additionally challenging about this, and it was sort of baked into your question, Adrian, where you asked, where's the Trump administration going? And I think one of the challenges is if we're talking about the Trump administration minus Trump, I actually have more clarity. As I think we were discussing in advance, you look at the array of officials that Trump has put into key positions across the entirety of the national security and defense bureaucracies, and they are almost all to the person what we would call a China hawk. What scrambles this calculation, though, is that same array of hawks are also pretty hawkish on Russia. We are not in a hawkish position vis-a-vis Russia right now because Trump's own views on foreign policy are quite distinct and very unique from the rest of his cabinet. So I think for our mental framework, we need to be thinking about what we could call the Trump administration and then Trump. Now, oftentimes, those two might be aligned, and Trump is in a similar position on an issue where the rest of his cabinet is. For example, I think the broader trade war that Trump is engaged in right now against Canada and Mexico, I don't know if there are many in the Trump administration, even the hawks, who think a trade war with Canada makes sense right now. But I would say most of them are aligned with Trump in terms of tariffs on China, probably for different reasons. A lot of the hawks want to be further incentivizing decoupling from China, are hoping that the tariffs can produce some strategic shifts of capital investment away from China and back to the United States. But there's an area where there's alignment. I think there's a lot of other areas. Taiwan is probably a good example where if you were to go down the line and ask members of Trump's administration their views on Taiwan, they would be very bullish and strong supporters of Taiwan. Trump is not. Trump has publicly said Taiwan is stealing our semiconductor industry. There's anecdotes from some of the memoirs and people who served in his first administration that he has made disparaging remarks about Taiwan, just does not see it as a huge strategic asset. So I won't belabor that point much more. And I realize that was just, I haven't even answered the question yet, but I just wanted to at least put that out there. I actually don't think that framework helps us at all. But I do think for those of us who are analyzing this, I'm increasingly less interested in thinking about what the Trump team thinks on a given issue, because we've seen, I think, most acutely in the example of Russia, where Trump has outsized authority in the Republican Party. He's not worried about being flanked on the right. There's no hawkish challenge to Trump. And his own unique views on foreign policy, I think you put those together, he has a wide latitude within his administration and within the Republican Party to pursue unorthodox foreign policy maneuvers like he's doing with Russia. That's clearly going to matter for our discussion here on China, because while Trump is not dovish on China, I don't think that's the right way to think about it. He's certainly not hawkish on China either.
So if I might follow up on your point about Trump being unorthodox. So what do you make of Trump's overtures to Putin in this so-called reverse Kissinger, right, where you make nice with Moscow, and that this is the prelude to the so-called pivot to Asia, that finally, and ironically, a pivot to Asia that was envisioned by Obama and Kurt Campbell would finally be fulfilled by Trump.
I am highly, highly skeptical that that is the strategy in President Trump's head. If it were the strategy in his head, I would be equally skeptical that that is an achievable strategy to implement. My guess is because Trump himself has not come out and endorsed that as a strategy, I suspect this is people in the administration who do not necessarily approve of our approach to Russia and are trying to find a way to publicly shape the narrative on what's happening here. And frankly, I think they're doing it somewhat half-heartedly. It's not like this is a key talking point every day at the State Department or Department of Defense podium. This just comes out every now and again. And I think there is such a concerted effort in Washington to look for strategy because none is being offered by Trump. People are filling in the vacuum on trade, for example. What is the purpose of the tariffs? Is this about, which Trump's trade advisor Navarro had said, the tariffs against Mexico and Canada are about fentanyl. This is a drug war tool. Or is this because Trump feels like they have not been good economic partners? Or is this about putting long-term tariffs in place so that businesses bring all of their investment here to the United States? Is this about just using leverage to get a better deal on a revised USMCA? The answer to the question is yes, it's all of those. I think we see something like this with the reverse Kissinger. Now, just quickly, first, I think let's not give this more credit than it deserves. This is not a reverse Kissinger, or a reverse Nixon, I should say. First of all, the interesting phenomenon of the rapprochement between the US and China in the early 1970s was not the Soviet Union piece, because China and the Soviet Union at that point had been adversaries since the late 1950s. Why we remember that is it's the rapprochement between two very unlikely allies, Mao Zedong and Richard Nixon, right? That's really what the story is about, less than the wedge that Nixon drove. The wedge was already there. There is no wedge between Moscow and Beijing right now. Now, I think you could argue that there, which people have been since the announcement in February 2022 of the No Limits Partnership, that yes, there are limits and there are elements of strategic distrust in the relationship between Russia and China. Absolutely. But this partnership has continued to grow and evolve, even amidst a pronounced war that has brought, for China especially, some pretty significant headaches in its bilateral relations across Europe. And yet, Xi Jinping and Putin just had a call a few weeks ago. They just did joint exercises with Iran. There's no evidence that they can be wedged in the way that some are arguing. So good luck if this is honestly what they're trying. And a final point I will make is, if this is the strategy, I'm not sure I would be saying it publicly. The Chinese have the internet. They can read our newspapers. Putin does too. The idea that Putin and Xi Jinping have just become stupid, I think, is not a plausible description of reality. So again, I think this is more window dressing than this is substantive.
Thanks, Jude. Yes, there is a reason why Kissinger secretly visited, right, Beijing before Nixon's visit. Thanks.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of things had to happen behind the scenes before the groundbreaking visit, I think in 1971.
Yeah, like 15 years of adversarial relations between Beijing and Moscow. I just think any discussion that is being had of a reverse Nixon cannot avoid that intractable point of history, which is so inapposite to the situation we're dealing with now.
That's true. That does bring me to another question, though. One of the other things that we're hearing in reports about the Trump administration is that Mr. Trump himself seems to subscribe to this idea of spheres of influence instead of American primacy per se. From what you know, what do you think this might mean, and what would it look like in practice?
It's another good question. Of course, Trump has not himself articulated a view as coherent as saying he believes in a spheres of influence view of international order, but I do think it works for now as a placeholder to describe the type of international order that Trump would be comfortable with, right? And we've seen, certainly Trump believes in a strong Monroe Doctrine here in North America, probably stronger than the Mexicans, the Canadians, the Colombians, and Denmark would like. I think it's also clear that Trump wants to engage directly with the strongest actors at the table. And in his view, rightfully, if you're looking for who the dominant power outside of the United States is in the Indo-Pacific, it's China. I think Russia is a more debatable point. Russia, in many ways, is a much, much weaker power than China is. And even within Europe, we've seen Russia's economy, although it is improving, is not nearly as productive, efficient, and strong as the collective European Union. But nonetheless, I think in Trump's view, he deeply respects Vladimir Putin as a strategist and a leader, and wants to cut out the middleman, which he sees as Europe, and deal directly with these strong powers. How it works in practice is obviously far more complicated and deeply unknowable. And this is where I want to be careful about us coming to conclusions about Trump being, for example, on the side of Russia or on the side of the United States. And in some ways, I think China, at brief periods, overinterprets Trump's comments as indicating that he is friendlier to Beijing than I think he actually is. Trump is certainly friendlier to Moscow and Beijing than almost any conventional politician in the United States. Anecdotally, I would say more friendly to those two leaders than almost anyone, including think tankers in Washington, D.C. But at the same time, Trump will turn on these countries if he feels disrespected, as we saw with the case of China in the second half of the Trump administration, right, where you saw just a remarkably different tone after COVID. The final year of Trump's administration, he gave a lot of latitude to more hawkish individuals in his administration to prosecute the sort of China strategy that they wanted to. So I think the problem with the spheres of influence analogy is it probably gives the two other spheres of Europe under Russian control and Asia under Chinese control, it indicates that Trump would be more hands-off than I think he might in practice. And the final point, and this is where the uncertainty comes, not just for us, our allies, but I think also for Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. It's one thing to look at the record of what Trump has said on Taiwan and say that we are uncertain how he would behave in some sort of Taiwan crisis, which is where I come down. It's another to say that he will just cut Taiwan loose and give it to China. Possible, certainly, but I think it's improbable, or I think it's unlikely. And so I think as we think about the spheres of influence model, we will need to refine it because it will not be sort of clean divisions between three spheres of influence or three mob families that have their own territory to run. I think it's going to be probably far more confusing, incoherent. And also, I think this is one where Trump is going to feel his way through the next several years, partly by navigating crises to arrive at a Trump doctrine. I think it's just way too early now to say that the Trump doctrine is spheres of influence, even if that, as an initial thesis, I think does make some sense.
Thank you. I quite like that mob family metaphor. Adrian?
So, Jude, I was wondering here if it was possible that a sort of middle ground for the Trump administration would then be the offshore balancer model, at least with regard to Asia. So this is Mearsheimer and Walt,
Right.
but also, right, sort of Bridge Colby's argument in Strategy for Denial that here the US would be, in Colby's term, right, sort of the cornerstone balancer, that this would give the US the chance to be sort of selectively, at least, engage in the region to preserve equilibrium or balance of power in Asia.
Look, I think that's an interesting alternative hypothesis. Again, I'm not sure that's the mental model in Trump's head. I do agree that that's probably the mental model in the heads of some in the Trump administration who have the view that the United States does not have the wherewithal or resources to be as forward deployed across as much of the globe as it is now. And I think the problem, offshore balancer makes more sense as a concept when thinking about Europe. I struggle, the challenging equities and flashpoints that the Trump administration will have to navigate across China's sphere of influence, I think are going to be extraordinary. The other thing I would say is I think China is such a formidable, active, competitive rival, which right this very moment, I mean, just over the last several weeks, I think has turned up the intensity of its actions, not only in Taiwan, but near New Zealand, near Australia. The offshore balancing would be so persistent that I think it would erode the theory that you are offshore. I think it would require the United States, I think in some ways has to decide, is it going to defend the existing order in the Indo-Pacific up to and including its existing security commitments? To do that, I think, is a bit of a challenge as an offshore balancer. And again, I'll just come down to the point where I'm also just not certain that's the theory of the case that's in Trump's head.
Thanks, Jude. So to follow up on that too, I'm struggling also to see how a so-called Trump pivot would be received in the region. So I've been trying to compare, what was originally envisioned by the Obama administration for rebalancing to Asia, that it would be a three-pronged approach to the region, right? A military one, right? An economic pillar based on CPTPP, but also, right, sort of intense diplomatic engagement with the region, and of course, right, not least of all with ASEAN. But with Trump, right, we know even a watered down IPAF is off the table. Come next month, the region is looking at reciprocal tariffs, and with lots of countries in Southeast Asia having large deficits, they are going to be easy targets for these tariffs. And also, since Trump has taken office, we have seen what I would describe as serious self-harm in terms of dismantling USAID with both development and humanitarian assistance to countries in need in the region. And also, just over the past week, the dismantling of Radio Free Asia. We are going to see, if a pivot occurs, right, a region that is, I think, sort of going to be highly challenged by the credibility of any pivot to the region.
Yes. At the same time, I think what Trump is wielding so effectively is, you may not like the United States. You may find us increasingly lacking credibility as a security and economic partner.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Trump's theory of the case is, where else are you going to go? And we're seeing that now. What Trump is doing with his ability to extract tribute from foreign governments and corporations is because he right now is constitutionally in control of the apparatus that manages the largest economy in the world, with the biggest market and some of the richest consumer markets in the world. So you've got to find a way to get a trade deal with him. In terms of a security partner, there's essentially two big choices you have. And I wouldn't even say China is really offering to be a security partner for everyone. You might not like the United States, but I would say up till now, the United States, its security posture has not shifted in the way that its trade and economic policy has, to being coercive, right? Which is what our economic policy is right now, by using the threat of and the actual implementation of tariffs. We're not running a protection racket for security, and I genuinely hope we never do. I think Trump understands the extraordinary power the United States has, and in fact feels that we were underutilizing that as a tool to get what the United States needed under previous administrations, right? There was too much. By the way, for listeners, just to be clear, I am giving a theory of the case for what I think Trump thinks, not what I think, but we were too deferential, bound by the Lilliputians. We were sort of tied down by these institutions that hamstrung us. Yes, allies are fine, but we were basically, as in the case in Europe, but as in the case with Taiwan and others, there's lackluster spending on defense. They're free riding off the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Trump, I think, is happy to take a withdrawal from the credibility bank, because he understands that pursuing credibility has left the United States overly stretched and exposed. On Trump's view, economic relations that were tilted towards exporting nations, we were just buying all their stuff and they weren't buying ours. Again, Trump very much views trade surplus deficits as a scorecard in a way that no economist does. And so I would say that probably the idea that when they pivot to Asia, they will face a more skeptical, maybe even hostile, frustrated set of partners in Asia. I just don't think that's going to bother him, unfortunately. And I think, just to be clear, I think that's a big problem. I don't agree with the way that Trump thinks about trade at all. I also am deeply disturbed by how we are using economic coercion in ways that are very familiar to those of us who have been studying China for a very long time. I think the challenge on the security side, though, is it's unfortunate that it feels like it takes Trump to produce profound shifts in how Europe, for example, is thinking about defense spending. Now, again, I wouldn't have supported, not that I would get hired in a Trump administration, but if I was, I would not have said that it is worth all the uncertainty, I think the damage that we are creating right now, just to get Germany to spend more on defense. I just don't think the trade-off is worth it. But nonetheless, I think in the Trump administration, the view is we have been criticizing Taiwan on defense spending for 2 decades. We have been asking the Europeans to do more for longer than that. And time again, we show up at a Munich security conference, everybody pledges to do more. And even after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the needle hasn't moved satisfactorily in terms of what defense spending as a percentage of GDP. I think that's just the worldview that they're bringing to this. And I think this was his view in the first administration. I think what's different now is there's no John Boltons, there's no Mike Pompeos, there's no sort of traditional Republican foreign policy thinkers to try to shape and constrain a bit. This is, I think, pure, unadulterated Trump worldview that is at the core of US policy right now.
Yes, I think it's probably best summed up in the president's phrase, right? You don't hold all the cards, we do.
Yeah, actually, just quickly on that, I think the other statement from that press conference that was illustrative for me was when he was at his angriest with Zelensky, and he said, I empowered you to be a tough guy. Now, what I find interesting about that is, A, he just obviously genuinely doesn't think Zelensky on his own is a tough guy in a way that I do. But B, I think it indicates how he thinks about, I don't think he would see Taiwan, for example, as necessarily as a plucky, embattled democracy. And this is where I think some of the worry, Adrian, I know you were in Taiwan recently, I was as well. I think some of the concern is if he sees Zelensky as free riding off US backstop and that Zelensky is being more aggressive to Russia than he ordinarily would be, but for the US backstop. How do you think about that if you're Taipei and you're trying to stand up against China? President Lai just gave a pretty tough speech last week on what he sees as the threat from China. Unfortunately, I think you could see a world in which Trump applies that same framework to Taipei and says, you're giving chest-thumping speeches here in Taipei about standing up to the China threat, but you're doing that in a large sense because the United States is backstopping you. If that view is in some ways at the core of how Trump is thinking about this, I think it does spell some challenges for those countries that are standing up to China, but doing so, under the umbrella of security assistance that the U.S. has provided.
Yes, that's a very good point because, as I mentioned, I was in Taiwan last week, and a lot of the concern too was that Taiwan had sort of shaped its narrative, as you pointed out, as this sort of plucky democracy standing up to the authoritarian challenge. Whereas I think, now they're getting the sense that the ground is shifting under their feet with Trump 2.0.
It's actually been something that I would say previous trips that I've taken to Taiwan, even in 2015, 2016, I was urging that a values-based framing was running out of steam, I think, in the United States. And now you've seen Taiwan is not just leaning in on values. They are also, of course, this is where the Silicon Shield argument becomes important and also is a little bit under threat right now. But I think they're trying to find ways to signal to the United States that it's not just a normative value proposition we have. It is actually, we are essential for really anything the United States wants to do economically or security-wise. I think the problem is, we saw Elon Musk gave comments yesterday, I think, where he said, essentially, in a positive sign for Taipei, essentially it's game over if China takes Taiwan because they get all the good chips. The second half of his statement, though, is what sends a ripple of fear down Taiwan as it thinks about its long-term relationship with the United States in security. Is Musk said, this is exactly why we need to do everything we can to bring production to the United States. Now, we're not close to having autonomy anywhere near that from Taipei, but these are the sorts of statements as Taipei looks to its future that send some chills down its spine. And I would imagine from Beijing, a slight sense of optimism here that if it can see this through over the next 10 years or so, it might not need to invade. It might have options available for political coercion that looked unthinkable just a few years ago.
Thanks, Jude. So speaking of China, we just had the conclusion of two sessions, 两会. So I know you are one of the most astute observers of Chinese political development. So from there, do you see how China is now shaping up to deal with Trump 2.0?
The policy agenda that came out of not just the two sessions, but I think that we've seen building momentum over the last several years is clearly premised on the theory that irrespective of who's in the White House or what possible deal might be a few months away, that's all transitory. And the United States continues to harbor hostile intentions towards China. It's bipartisan that Americans want to contain China's rise. Mm-hmm. And so we, Beijing, basically need to push further with more emphasis, with more focus on building out our own version of resilience, right? Economic, technological resilience, political resilience. I think some have framed this as Fortress China. I've never liked that analogy because it would make you think that China is sort of drawing inwards. And in many ways, I think what you're seeing is to build a resilient, self-reliant, or as self-reliant as possible economy, technological ecosystem. Actually, in many ways, China is pushing out to build and strengthen relationships across Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia. Russia is a part of that resilience strategy. I think this is why China will not give up and think that Europe is a lost cause. I know for a fact right now that China is reformulating its approach to Europe and looking at the member state level to repair some of the damage that's been done since February 2022. So I think in one ways you could look at China's strategy and say they are focused on the longer game here, which is they expect intense geopolitical rivalry with the United States across a number of domains, and policy is really focused on that. It's true. Now, at the same time, I think the Chinese see a window of opportunity with President Trump that they felt they haven't had since the first meeting between Trump and Xi back in 2017. Trump thinks differently about China than almost any other, as we mentioned earlier, elected official. Trump is unique, certainly amongst the Republican Party, but I think probably amongst both parties in publicly advocating for more Chinese investment into the United States. Everyone in Trump's cabinet was strongly supportive of banning TikTok. TikTok is legally banned in the United States by statute, but the Trump administration is ignoring a law passed by Congress, signed into law by President Biden, which should make TikTok technically unworkable or in the United States, but Trump has ignored it. That's another signal. I was in Munich for the Munich Security Conference, and I was hosting an event, a side event there with some Chinese. And I would say that's the weekend J.D. Vance gave his now infamous speech. I would say that probably the only people who liked that speech in the entirety of the Munich Security Conference security corridor were the Chinese, because they heard him say, the threat for Europe is not from Russia, it's not from China, the threat is within. So China's picking up on all these signals from the Trump administration at a high level that give it some room for optimism. Now, below Trump, as we were saying, there's a number of policies and documents coming out, whether it's the America First Investment Plan, whether it's the fact that the State Department under Secretary of State Marco Rubio removed language on Taiwan that unnerved Beijing. This is the language about that we do not support Taiwan independence. That language is gone. So I think what Beijing is trying to figure out right now is, A, it's keeping its antenna attuned to Trump first and foremost. It's a little bit like us think tankers who sometimes listen too much to Chinese academics who talk about the need for economic reform and forget that actually they don't really matter. What matters is what comes from Xi Jinping, People's Daily, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a similar effort underway here that Beijing is trying to figure out, is Trump stringing us along? And I think the evidence in favor of that is he's sort of dangled the prospect of, yes, we can talk, yes, we can do a deal, but we've now had two successive rounds of moderate when compared to the 60% tariff level that was being floated last year. But there's an argument that Trump is salami slicing here, that he is sort of dangling better relations sometime in the future, and then he is just nibbling away at the tariff front. Someone mentioned to me yesterday, who's more plugged in than I am by a long shot, that they thought there was another 10% tariff hike coming because the argument will be China hasn't done enough on fentanyl. So I think Beijing is trying to figure out, are they being strung along? They are actively working to create lists of investments that they can do into the U.S. economy, export restrictions. What can they do to step up interdictions of fentanyl precursors? You name it. Can they play some role in Ukraine settlement, post-settlement economic development, a whole package of things that they can put in front of the Trump administration to try to get to a deal in the summer. And hopefully, I think from Beijing's perspective, in response to good faith on the Chinese part. They'd like to see the Trump administration roll back some of the export controls, drop some of the sanctions. I think in Beijing, ideally, they'd like to roll back these 20% tariffs that have been added since January. I think they would take it as a win if the tariffs just didn't go higher than that for now. And then I also think, China would like to sneak in a few wins on Taiwan. I think that could be something as simple as a readout from a Xi-Trump meeting, having some new language that Beijing likes. Maybe it's language that says instead of the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence, maybe it says the U.S. opposes Taiwan independence. And that would be the sort of move where, for most normal human beings who don't live in Taiwan and who don't engage in the sort of work we do, they wouldn't know the difference between does not support and opposes. I think everyone in Taiwan would know exactly what that meant, and they would see it as a very worrying sign that Beijing has traction on the Taiwan issue. And it could be the sort of thing where Trump thinks, look, it's a tiny concession. We're getting a big, beautiful deal out of this. It's changing one or two words. Who cares? So I think that's Beijing's position. I think people who argue that Beijing is just over the moon confident, I think that's a misreading. You can never be over the moon confident with Trump because you don't know if and when he's going to change his perspective on things. And more importantly, though, and I think this is the bigger picture, I think Beijing believes even if they get a deal in the summer and they can tap the brakes on the tariff war, the broad change in U.S.-China relations, the trajectory is not going to fundamentally alter. And I think they certainly know, look, Trump's a lame duck. Knock on wood, he can't run again under the 22nd Amendment. And my hope is, having studied Chinese politics for a long time, there's no third term. But I think, Beijing also knows if President Trump's only going to be around for 2.5 more years, we don't know what's after that. We look at the Republican Party, aside from Trump, and they're all hawks. Democrats are more or less hawkish on China. So let's get what we can while Trump's in office, but let's prepare for what's after Trump.
I see. Thank you. So from what you've been saying then, this prospect of a deal between Washington and Beijing, it's from Beijing's side, it's mainly firstly to buy time, to kind of wait out the Trump administration in its potentially lame duck phase, but also to secure whatever benefits they can, right?
Yeah, I'd reverse that, right? So use the deal to stop an escalating tariff war, gain some concessions on sanctions, technology controls, and if you're lucky, sneak some other things in there. I think the other point to make is I think Beijing also knows if you fail on this trade negotiation, you don't just get to move on to another issue to negotiate with Trump. That's the point at which I think they understand all those hawks standing behind Trump, they all get hall passes or hunting licenses. So I think there's an added incentive for Beijing to find some sort of settlement, which is if they can't keep Trump interested, then Trump is not interested and he'll let other people who are more interested in China have more latitude. And I think Beijing feels like that would be disastrous.
I see. And what would you think the window of opportunity for this kind of deal would be? I think you mentioned the summer, right? Or would the soft deadline be before the midterms next year?
I'm not sure there's a hard deadline based on our political calendar. For a few weeks, the rumor mill here in DC has had it that there would be some sort of June summit. Wall Street Journal is reporting that they see a June summit. The important anecdote to add here is that Trump and Xi more or less share a birthday if you stay up to close to midnight on the 15th and 16th of June. So, jokingly, the sort of the birthday summit, Trump likes that sort of symbology. So I don't know. It's certainly plausible. And again, you saw we're recording March 18th. So yesterday, Trump confirmed unofficially, but said that Xi Jinping will be coming to the United States in the not too distant future. I think there had been questions about, does Trump go to Beijing? Does Beijing come here? There's also questions about, is this a leader level summit in Washington, or is this a Mar-a-Lago summit? I think all that's probably to be determined.
Just to follow up on that question about the deal then, it kind of stands to reason that any deal that comes out of this potential summit in June, it wouldn't be the most stable of deals, right? It's mainly just a holdover of sorts to satisfy both sides for a little while, but it doesn't address any of the fundamental issues between the two of them.
I think that's a fair assumption. We've seen Trump go after USMCA as a pretty horrible deal, despite the fact that USMCA was a deal negotiated by the Trump administration. So I think it's safe to say that a deal would not be permanent if it was signed under Trump. I think it's also Trump signed a trade deal with China before. Trump administration view is China did not live up to its end of the bargain on that. So there will also be a lot of people in the Trump administration who would like a deal to fail sooner than later. That way the handcuffs can come off them. So I think it's probably fair to assume that while we might see a general tone and tenor of improved relations moving into a possible summit in the summer, my bet would be a year after that summit, the U.S.-China relationship will be probably reverting back to where the status quo ante of pretty contentious. Now, I should say just on a personal level, and I think all of us probably share this view, no one is wishing for poor U.S.-China relations given the magnitude of the knock-on effects. I think what some of the concern is about the way that Trump himself is pursuing a possible deal is that it's not clear that he will, as he moves along the path to get a deal, he will maintain many of the competitive actions that I think many, myself included, think across a large number of domains are necessary to keep in place, because while it would be nice to not have a trade war with China, we still need a whole swath of competitive positions vis-a-vis China. Nothing has fundamentally changed about Xi Jinping's view of the world, about the Chinese political system, about their, international economic foreign policy. The problems I think that many of us had with that 6 months ago, those problems are still here. And in some ways, some of those problems are escalating, especially if you're looking at this from New Zealand or Australia or Taiwan. So hope for an improved U.S.-China relationship, but not if it comes at the expense of really leaning in to support our partners and allies. You could imagine a world where China, as it moves towards a deal or signs one, immediately starts ramping up pressure against the Philippines, against Taiwan, against our traditional allies in the region, potentially misreading the room and thinking that Trump is completely soft on China. And this is where, to revert to a statement I was making before, it'd be a mistake to say that he's a hawk on China. I think it would be a mistake in many ways to say that he's a dove on China.
I see. That's certainly true. And it kind of gels with what one of the other people that we met in DC said, that, remember, Adrian, that the US-China relationship of the latter half of this Trump administration is probably going to be defined by how both sides respond to a failed deal, or, what happens after the deal is made.
Exactly.
That's a great point. I wish I'd thought of that, and I might steal that comment moving forward, because I think that's a really, really astute point.
Yeah. Do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to leave the listeners with, Jude?
Have faith. The United States is going through a challenging period right now. In some ways, U.S. foreign policy feels like it is going in totally new directions. Sometimes it feels like when you look below the surface of the waves on top, there's so much about the U.S. architecture of its foreign policy and security policy, which is not in any way fundamentally changed. So I think this is going to be a pretty volatile period, to be sure. I think there's a lot of folks who are going to try to help manage this effectively. I have streaks of optimism where I think this is going to be a challenging period, but we'll make it through this. But this is where really the importance of friends and allies, it's a time where I just really emphasizes how important these are for the United States, even if some in the US government don't see them as such. We really can't do anything important across security, across climate, technology, without that network of strong partners and allies. And I truly hope at some point the Trump administration and President Trump himself comes to recognize how much of a critical asset these are rather than a liability.
Well said, and we hope so too. Well then, thanks for your time, Jude. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If there are any questions or topics that you'd like us to tackle in future episodes, feel free to reach out to us on social media or through email. Until next time, stay safe, and we'll see you again.